Every day, China is getting closer and closer to completing their 2049 plan, their grand plan to take over the world. And after years of growth, Chinese President Xi Jinping is now shifting his focus towards expanding his empire and laying the groundwork for an invasion of Taiwan. And China's military is now even overtaking the US's. And with China and Putin coming closer together, it's clear that the US's superpower status is starting to decline. So imagine you're the president of the United States. How are you going to stop China from taking over the world? Well, in this video, we're going to go over the 7 ways on how to take down China's government, including the most extreme way, the quickest way, and the most realistic way. Now, the most obvious route is just to invade China. You could just march straight in and remove the government by force. But how would a full-scale invasion of China actually play out? Well, it certainly wouldn't be easy. As I mentioned before, China's military is already a part of what makes it a global superpower. With 2 million active service members and a further 500,000 in reserve, China has the troops to match any country on Earth. And an invasion of China would also put their conscription into effect, adding tens to hundreds of millions of people to China's fighting forces. And it's not just the amount of people. You would be facing state-of-the-art modern military technology, some of the best the world has ever seen. Thousands of attack aircraft, AI robots, tens of thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, millions of bombs, shells and bullets, and a whole array of nuclear weapons. And so if you weren't going to do a land invasion, your next bet might be a naval invasion. Especially in the case that China invades Taiwan, America's best bet is to use their navy to destroy China. And President Biden has already announced that he would come to the defense of Taiwan in the event of an invasion.
U.S. forces, U.S. men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
However, China's navy is no joke. It's already surpassed the US Navy in numbers of ships in 2020, and this number is still growing. They've also now got some very powerful allies. Right now, Russia and China are closer than they've ever been. One country with the most nuclear weapons, and the other with the largest military in the world, and this would be a hugely formidable force for the US. However, the US and its allies do have more nukes and guns and bombs than China specifically, which is why an invasion would inevitably lead to a nuclear war, which would inexorably wipe off both countries from the map. But let's just imagine for a second, even if an invading force could somehow obliterate China's military, and then also replace its government, it still wouldn't achieve our goal of ousting the CCP for good. In fact, China's communist government first came to power off the back of foreign invaders when the Japanese invaded in the early 20th century. So another invasion like this would just reunite the Chinese population again, and play right into the hands of Xi Jinping. And with the whole of humanity facing near extinction in the event of this, an outright invasion really just isn't the best idea here. Because as we can see, invading China just isn't realistic. So then what is realistic? Well, the first step in weakening China's government is to limit its influence overseas, something the West is already in the process of doing. Now, the main way that China exerts its control over the West today is through its government-owned tech companies like Huawei and Tencent. And one of the most effective weapons in their arsenal of control is TikTok. Because of its extremely addictive algorithms, TikTok has exploded in popularity, being on almost all millennials and Generation Z's phones. And because of Chinese law, this has given the Chinese government a backdoor into billions of people's devices across the world. All Chinese companies must send back their data to the Chinese government, and not just send their data back, they must also hide out that they're sending this data back to the Chinese government. And then from there, they can harvest whatever data they like about the world. And it's not just the data, the cultural implications of this are just as important. China's ownership of things like TikTok means they have a guiding hand on the culture of the next generation. And you can already see how China's doing this through what it promotes to people on TikTok itself. You see, as you may be aware, China's version of TikTok shows young people educational videos, patriotic propaganda, and other self-improvement content promoting the nation and the family. All of this allows the Chinese government to mold their population into good, obedient Chinese citizens. However, TikTok in other countries is a completely different story. Anyone can find anything on the internet, including your full legal name, your personal email, your home address, phone number, and even your relatives. This information is accessible because of data brokers, who profit by selling your information to robocallers, telemarketers, spammers, and anyone else that wants to learn more about you. And that's why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Aura. Aura will identify data brokers that are exposing your information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They'll even opt you out of junk mail and telemarketing lists. And you can use my link aura.com/moon to try 2 weeks for free and see how many data brokers are sharing your information. Also linked in my description or scan the QR code. Aura also monitors your emails and passwords to see if they're involved in a data breach and exposed on the dark web, giving you recommendations on what to do. Aura's app also features a VPN, password manager, real-time credit, and identity theft monitoring, internet parental controls, and protects your device from malware. Aura has almost every internet safety tool you'll ever need, all inside of one app. So let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. And if you sign up right now, Aura will give you a 2-week free trial with my link. And you'll be shocked at how much of your private information Aura finds exposed over those 2 weeks. So go to aura.com/moon to start your free trial. Also linked in the description or scan the QR code. On the TikTok that the West gets to use, the algorithm will go out of its way to promote shocking and addictive content. Most of the time this content is just completely degenerate, meant to flatten the spirit of the youth. In fact, TikTok is quite literally shown to change the brains of kids, to destroy their attention span and dopamine. And this is just TikTok. This doesn't even mention all the other insane cultural weapons that China uses against the West. And as the West culture slowly becomes poisoned and the US weakens, we are now starting to see China rise to the top. So if you're the president and you want to take down China, you need to deal with this as soon as possible. And that's why the US banned TikTok on all government devices in December. And now they're heavily considering a total ban. And very soon TikTok could be completely banned in the US, like it is already in India. Other bans will then also need to follow for Chinese tech companies. Companies like Huawei, which is often accused of data harvesting, and for good reason. Their cheap products and infrastructure comes with a hidden cost, all of your information being sold back to the Chinese government. And removing this dimension of influence takes away one of China's most effective ways to exert soft power. And by doing this, the West would completely weaken China's ability to influence the West. But obviously TikTok isn't the only thing China has to exert influence. So this leads on to step 2 of taking down China, to isolate them by undermining their economy. Now this is a mammoth task when you consider how strong China's economy really looks on the surface. In fact, it's grown at one of the highest rates in history. For example, just in 1980, China's GDP was less than Spain's, making them the 12th largest economy in the world rankings. But then after a series of economic reforms and an explosion in China's middle class, they now sit in second place with a GDP of nearly $20 trillion, a number that's soon going to overtake the US's. So then how has Xi Jinping and the CCP used this economic strength? Well, they've used this money to buy friends. In what's called the Belt and Road Initiative, China has put billions into investments in Asia and Africa. They've funded hospitals, roads, skyscrapers and bridges, countless mega projects that are designed to catapult all these poor nations into having a prosperous future. At least this is what they want everyone to believe. In reality, these massive construction projects are toxic in the long term. Like the Lotus Tower in Sri Lanka, it's a 350-meter tall monument to pride and waste that cost around $113 million to make, most of which only came from a Chinese loan. And now Sri Lanka's drowning in debt. The country is about to collapse. The people can't even afford food, fuel and rent. And all of this can be traced back to the country's massive debt to China, which is why you can only bet that Sri Lankan society is beginning to get a little bit resentful. And by exploiting this in Sri Lanka and many other countries like Pakistan, you could then take away a large portion of China's regional allies. And if the West stepped in to actually provide aid and stabilize these economies, they would then provide an alternative to China's debt-trapping colonialism. Soon, China would quickly run out of friends, weakening their geopolitical position and their government's ability to stay in control. And across the world, the dominoes would fall, and China's international prestige would start to massively decline. And so if you're the president and you've got rid of TikTok, and now all these other sources of Chinese influence, you're now starting to see that alliances become undermined. But this still really isn't enough to take down China. So next you're going to need to move on to step 3, attacking China's economy directly. Now there's a few ways you could do this. But at first you need to understand how China's economy works in the first place. Now China has developed its economy by shifting it towards more advanced manufacturing. Instead of just t-shirts and cheap plastics, China now makes iPhones and electronics. As we all know, it's the global manufacturing hub, and it's this reason that has catalyzed their incredible growth, but it's also given them massive economic weakness, a weakness that the West could exploit. You see, all of the electronics they make need specific computer chips called semiconductors, which are mostly made in the US, Taiwan, Japan and South Korea, with about 90 specifically coming from Taiwan. And all of these countries are US allies. So if you cut the trade between these countries and China, this would then be a massive blow to China's economy. In fact, this is what the whole trade war has been about recently. The US has tried to strangle China's economy by adding tariffs to the export of these vital components to China, increasing the cost for the CCP by hundreds of billions of dollars. Now China does have a plan to get around this, and this is by making their own semiconductors, but so far they've had very limited success. And whilst their semiconductor market share has almost tripled in the past 10 years, they're still very far from catching up, especially for a country of over 1 billion people. They're also still behind technologically as well, as most of the chips China makes are old and outdated, despite the billions they've poured into research and development. But they won't be behind for long. China has made semiconductor independence one of the main parts of their 2049 plan for global dominance. By their current estimates, they'll be making 70% of the chips they use by 2035. And if you want to stop them and take down their government, it's clear that you have to cut off semiconductor imports to China completely, and you have to do it fast before China can catch up. So here's where things get interesting. By now, Xi Jinping and his cronies will be in trouble, as you banned TikTok, stripped away their allies and kneecapped their economy. And with all of this pressure mounting, it's very likely that China will eventually invade Taiwan. And in that case, This then leads on to step 4, assassination. Now, this really won't be easy. Xi is notoriously paranoid and takes every measure possible to protect himself. Like when he visited Hong Kong in 2022, he traveled in a bulletproof armored car surrounded by 50 other security vehicles. Any would-be assassin couldn't even get close on foot or by car, and a remote bomb or drone just wouldn't work either, because of specialist signal jamming vehicles. In fact, Xi even had a helicopter patrolling above to deter any attack from the air. So the only reliable way would be to find an ally within Xi Jinping's inner circle, someone with exclusive access to the dictator. Now this will be very tricky. Xi's confidence will have been chosen for their underlying loyalty, but once the walls are done to close in on the CCP, it will be easier to find someone looking to take him out. And then the death of Xi Jinping would ultimately be disastrous for the CCP, simply because of how Xi Jinping has changed China's government. He has become the central figure of China. Because ever since he took power, Xi has made himself dictator for life. He's hoarded power at any cost, cracking down on political opponents and anyone else who can challenge him, like China's billionaires. In fact, tons of them have gone missing in China for speaking out against the regime. Like Ren Zikang, the billionaire real estate tycoon who called Xi a clown, and then soon after, oddly went missing, eventually reappearing a year later in a Chinese kangaroo court, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Which, to put into context, is like if Joe Biden gave Elon Musk or Bill Gates a life sentence over a Twitter thread. But by centralizing power, Xi has made the CCP completely reliant on him, and if he suddenly disappears, the resulting power vacuum could bring China to its knees. Xi has plenty of rivals and enemies within his own party. In fact, there's so many that it's doubtful whether you need to get your hands dirty in the first place. But as a direct assassination of Xi Jinping would look incredibly badly on the US's part, and also raise massive suspicions within China, this just really isn't a very realistic plan, moral questions aside. So the fifth more realistic step of taking down the CCP is to encourage those around Xi to replace him as leader. But in order to understand how to do this, you need to first know about what keeps a dictator in power in the first place. You see, it was Aristotle who outlined the 3 things you need for a successful tyranny, beginning with keeping the populace and your subjects humble. Now Xi doesn't need to worry about this. A way in which Chinese culture is different to the West is their culture of shame. Anybody who breaks societal norms is severely punished. Things like speaking out against the government or even getting bad grades leads to social isolation and shame. And China's social credit system is just a literal representation of this system, where you are ranked for being a good citizen by the government. And if you get a low score for doing bad things like criticizing the government, littering or committing crime, you then lose points. And if you lose so many points, you suddenly can't get trains. You can't get access to houses. You have to pay more tax. And people who speak to you then lose points, completely shunning you from society. And whilst this massive pressure might make people and students work harder, a lot of people can't face this shame and eventually take their own lives, which is a very effective system to keep control in the country. But a tyrant also needs to make sure his subjects can't trust each other, so that they can't cooperate to overthrow him. Xi, like all other tyrants, accomplishes this through networks of informants at every level of society. And then lastly, a tyrant needs to limit their subjects' political power. Xi has done this by removing his rivals through political purges, and we saw this firsthand at a recent party congress in October of 2022. Just after the press were admitted so that everyone could see, Xi publicly humiliated the former Chinese leader by having him forcibly removed from the meeting. However, the rest of Xi's political purges have been far less ceremonious and far more brutal. Under his supposed anti-corruption arrest sprees, Xi's political rivals have been imprisoned or worse, and all of these measures create a strong illusion of power which just won't break easily. But however powerful Xi Jinping can make himself, he will always be at the mercy of his underlings. The people who run his various ministries for him are the real holders of power, and they can exert pressure whenever they want to. This is likely the reason Xi stepped back from his disastrous zero-COVID policy. The crisis that he created was too much for them to handle, and so they were forced into a humiliating backtrack, stopping their lockdowns and admitting their mistakes, despite the humiliation it caused them. And so if they get too unhappy with Xi's rule, they'll have no hesitation in electing a new leader for China. And if they do, it could be very likely that a new leader will roll back Xi's authoritarian policies, which could bring down the whole CCP, as dictatorships always collapse when they give people too much freedom after years of repression. It creates a snowball effect which brings down the regime, and it westernizes the country that's so against the West, which if you're the American president, this is perfect for bringing down China's hegemony. But no new regime in China or anywhere else would survive without popular support, and that's why step 6 in taking down China is to encourage this in any way that you can. But doing this right is easier said than done. You see, the West has an awful track record of trying to force freedom on other countries, as often that freedom was just a different dictator anyway. I mean, just look at Cuba, Vietnam, Iran, and just dozens of other examples. Instead, you need to wake China's people up to their regime without direct interference, and the best way to get that information out is through the internet. Now, Xi Jinping is aware of this. His regime does everything it can to suppress the free flow of information. That's why they built the Chinese firewall, a way to block nearly all outside influences on the internet, and instead using dedicated censorship algorithms and agents to act as cyber police. But Chinese citizens have already found a way around them. By not referencing protests and acts against the government by name, and instead using vague concepts like it and what happened, you can actually beat the algorithm searching for keywords. And by spreading the truth in this way, you can evade censorship algorithms while keeping the message intact. Just recently, protesters used white flags to symbolize their hate against the regime, as white flags couldn't be censored by any algorithm. And so once you start building up these conflicting viewpoints within the country, Chinese propaganda then gets much less effective, and disrupting China's cradle-to-grave indoctrination machine is very vital to bringing down the regime. But you can't really expect China to suddenly become a democratic paradise in the space of just a few years or months. I mean, throughout its entire history, China has always been dominated by one authoritarian regime after another, and it's not easy to break a pattern that's gone on for thousands of years. However, it isn't out of the question completely. Taiwan, for example, moved from autocracy to democracy in the space of just a few decades after years of one-party rule. And this change towards democracy in Taiwan came just a decade or two after their economy modernized and developed. And as the people there became richer, the country opened up to the world. And this is the exact same point of development that China is reaching today. But instead, the opposite has happened when Xi Jinping made the country more totalitarian. And in this way, China is running the largest political experiment of all time. Developed nations and strict authoritarian control don't really normally mix. As people get richer and better educated, they generally demand more freedom. So China's newly developed middle class just simply haven't woken up to their new power yet. However, this is coming very soon. Even without taking any of the steps that we've just talked about, the CCP's future is still incredibly doubtful, as once she eventually dies or loses power, the whole system will be at massive risk. But even before that happens, there's still huge problems to deal with, and that's why the seventh and final step in taking down China is just to watch and wait. Because one issue that the CCP is desperately trying to deal with is their massively aging population. But a lot of countries have aging populations. So what's making this an existential threat to China? Well, years of the infamous one-child policy have dramatically shifted Chinese culture towards having fewer children. Chinese women used to have 6 children on average in 1970, but today, this has been artificially lowered to just 1.28. And that's why China's population has fallen for the first time in decades in 2022. And this gets very scary for the CCP once you look at what it's going to do to their economy. You see, China's population boom in the 60s and 70s gave them manpower to become a superpower. It's why their military is so strong. But this is about to turn around on them, as now over 20% of China's population are elderly, and soon they'll be joined by China's largest generation yet. China's youth, their smallest generation, will be left to support them and keep the country running. But it's not going to do very well. You see, Japan faced the exact same population issue in the 90s, and couldn't stop it either. That population bust came with 3 decades of economic stagnation, and China's economy is already starting to falter. The most recent economic growth of just 3% was the lowest they've seen in decades, and experts only predict it to get worse. So looking to the future, it's incredibly likely that China could crumble under its own weight without any outside interference. But a descent into anarchy wouldn't be any better than the China of today. China would just be invaded, or extremist ideologies would just pop up again. And one look at the awful statistics of China's civil wars will show you the level of tragedy waiting just around the corner. Tens of millions would perish in the chaos if the CCP fell tomorrow. And so the best outcome for the world would instead be a slower transition towards a less authoritarian and evil government. But this might already be too late. China's economy is in an awful situation right now, and this is one of the major signs of an imminent government collapse.